There is, of course, a huge family of theories which are basically all got the same general correct idea. I call them bundle theories after David Hume, who only used the term bundle once, to my knowledge, to describe the self as a bundle of perceptions, ideas and thoughts. But it became used, Thomas Reid used it to kind of mock David Hume. Hume thinks we're just bundles, and it kind of stuck. And I think sometimes the best words for a position are the mocking ones, because it shows that, you can take the criticism, you can take that thing. So the bundle theories, I think, have various characteristics. I just want to run over what they are, because if we remind ourselves what are the core defining aspects of the bundle theories, I think you can then see what they do and do not entail. So the first thing we might say about bundle theories is that it asserts that a self is a collection and not a collector. Right? So what I mean is this, the common sense view, I think, is if you say to somebody what their relationship is to their experiences, their memories and so forth, it is that they are the person who has them. So there is an I remember, I think, I believe, and so forth. This little core around which other things collect. And of course, bundle theories say, that's not true. We just are those things. We are the collection. You just put all those memories, experiences, ideas, perceptions together, and that is you. There is nothing beyond that. Now, because that's the way I take this view to be, I take it to be the view which is common to Buddhism, a lot of contemporary neuroscientists, and a lot of people in philosophy as well. I take it that doesn't mean, in any kind of bland way at least, that the self is an illusion. I think it means that the self is simply like everything else in the entire universe, apart from perhaps some fundamental forces. If you take anything at all that exists and you analyse it, you find there isn't a thing there which has bits attached to it. It is just a collection of bits. Water is H2O. It doesn't mean there is something called water, which you then attach hydrogen and oxygen to, and hydrogen and oxygen in the right form. That's just what water is. Same thing here. I don't think this image is an illusion, even though there is nothing to the image other than parts, the little pixels of light and so forth. So there are illusions surrounding the self, right? So it is an illusion of the self if you come to think of the self as something which is permanent, unchanging and abiding and so forth. But it's not an illusion to think the self exists as this collection and not a collector. So I think that's the first really key core idea, and so it's worth being clear about what that is. Second feature of bundle theories is that the idea that the self becomes like a verb rather than a noun. That's a slightly sort of a perhaps cheesy way of putting it. I mean, there is a perfectly acceptable sense in which I kind of is a noun. I've already said that a collection, you can refer to a collection in a noun form. But I think if you think of the self as more like a verb than a noun, I think it's helpful in pointing towards what makes it different to just an ordinary object is that it doesn't exist unless it is doing things. There has to be a process. There has to be thoughts and memories and activity. And it's a dynamic thing. It's changing and it's flowing. It is true that, what is it? Parmenides said you can never step into the same river twice. But, the reason for that is actually you can't do anything twice. There's a sense in which you are constantly changing, evolving, moving from one thing to another. And that's what stops you being literally the same object from moment to moment. But it's also what makes it possible for you to be the kind of thing you are at all. It is precisely because we are these dynamic systems, changing over time, losing memories, gaining new ones, and so forth, that we can be subjects of experience. So it's the very thing which makes it impossible for us to persist in the same way as chairs and tables, makes it possible for us to exist as individual people. So that's the kind of second key feature of bundle theories. And a third, highly ordered, not strictly bordered. I try to get things that rhymed a bit here, it helps to be a little bit memorable. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, again, I think that sometimes people, particularly when drawing on current neuroscience, there's a lot of current neuroscience, and not just neuroscience, but experimental psychology, which shows that, or I don't think shows that actually, let me rephrase that. I think adds more evidence and puts more flesh on the bones of an idea which a lot of people knew before people did this, that there isn't this core of self. I think Rita Carter this morning made the point, I think, that neuroscience really has shown that there is no point in the brain, for example, where it all comes together. Sense of self emerges from lots of different processes in the brain, and some are more important than others. So that's why some people might misleadingly point to things like the prefrontal cortex as being where the self is and so forth. But it's not like that. It's the whole system together, and it's rather fragmented. And through thoughts like that, not just things in neuroscience, but also insights from perhaps meditation, where you become aware of the emptiness at the core of being, or however you wish to phrase it, that people lose sight of the fact that although it's true that there is no core, there is no center, nevertheless, what's quite remarkable is that actually this thing we call the self is a highly ordered system. The fact of the matter is that you do remember quite a lot. You can remember certainly enough. I know memory is very unreliable and so forth, but there is stability of things like personality traits and so forth. Normally, if you arrange to, for example, invite someone to come and give a talk, even 12 months later, A, they will turn up, and B, they will give a talk on the subject you thought they were going to give, and C, it'll probably have more or less the same point of view you thought they would, right? It's not often that, 12 months later, someone sort of goes, I'm sorry, I can't come anymore because I've had a complete transformation, I no longer... these things do happen, but they're unusual. There's a lot of stability to this collection. There's a lot of order to it. If you want sort of evidence of that, just go to a school reunion or something. Now, I went to a school reunion recently. Very interesting experience, because here I am for a long time been writing about how we're fluid, dynamic, and change and so forth. And yet, you know what I'm going to say. You meet these people who you last saw 25 years ago. That's why we got together. It's 25 years. And you recognize that they have changed, obviously, but in other ways, they are absolutely, completely the same people. There's a stability about their mannerisms, the way they talk, their personality traits, even their interests and things. We don't transform. So that really shouldn't be forgotten in our haste to kind of embrace the fluidity of the self, that there's it's a remarkably tightly ordered thing. But it's highly ordered, but it's not strictly bordered. I think that's a real point that comes out. And people do talk about how, on any kind of bundle view, the difference between yourself and other people and your life and death becomes fuzzier. I think that's true. What you discover is that, you're not this tight pearl. There isn't this tight pearl, to use that image, at the core of you. There is this bundle. And so it's not strictly bordered. I think perhaps the clearest example of how the self is not strictly bordered is the tragic one of dementia. I'm sure many people in this room will know someone, perhaps probably close to someone who's suffered from dementia. And it's very interesting when you talk to people who are very close to someone with dementia about how they see that person in the later stages of life, right in the very late stages of dementia, when they no longer even recognize them. They no longer recognize perhaps the person they married. And what you find is that there are sort of conflicting ways of seeing that, paradoxical almost. Sometimes people will talk as though the person they knew is gone and dead. So, for example, it is a very common thing that when someone from dementia actually dies and people give their sympathy, the people will say, yes, it was awful, but in some ways I've already been through most of the mourning, yeah? They've already, because in the sense that they lost the person they knew a long time ago. But at the same time, people don't act completely in accordance with that. They continue to look after and love the person. Someone I interviewed about this was talking about this. A young person in the care home asked, do you still love your wife? And, he wasn't offended because she was young, naive, but he said, of course, he didn't have to think about it. Of course he did. So there's this sort of paradoxical thing. In some ways, we think that the person has gone. In some ways, we think they're still there, and we wouldn't abandon them for anything, and we still love them. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because of this idea that, the very boundary or notion of the self is not something which is strictly bordered and demarcated. If you want to ask whether anyone is the same person that they were 5 years ago, yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, late stages of dementia, early stages of dementia, whatever it might be, the answer is never yes or no. It's always to a certain extent yes, to a certain extent no. Most of the time, it's sufficiently, to a certain extent, yes, that in normal speech it's not problematic. We talk about the same person, we all know what we mean. But there are situations whereby when that becomes more difficult. Not just dementia, there's also the example, of course, people who committed crimes many, many years ago. If you catch someone 30 years after they committed a horrendous crime, is it just to try them? Are they still the same person? If you want a yes-no question to that, you're in trouble. The only answer you're going to get is in some ways yes, in some ways no, and justice needs to decide which is the most important. So look, that's a kind of sketch of the bundle view as I kind of see it. Now, if you take that to be the case, as I've said, there's a sense in which there are illusions around self, but I don't think it follows the self doesn't exist. So what kind of things do we have to be a bit careful of? What are the traps we might fall into? Well, the first one is I've already really said, that not self is not no self, to use this slogan. This sort of was made really clear to me when I spoke to Stephen Batchelor. People might know Stephen Batchelor, Buddhist. He used to call himself an agnostic Buddhist. He's now a Buddhist atheist. And he points out that in one of the great bundle theories is the Buddhist view of anatta. And he points out, it's an-atta. An is the privative, not atta. It's the atman. It's a particular idea of self and soul. And the whole point of anatta is that what you are is not that. It's not that fixed, abiding self. It doesn't mean there's no self at all. And you can point to teachings of the Buddha in which he talks about the importance of cultivating the self, working on yourself, and so forth. He couldn't think it possible to work on yourself if he thought the self just didn't exist, full stop. So the Buddhist view of not self, whether this is your authentic view or not, I don't really care, if you like, but to me the most sensible way of interpreting a Buddhist view and views like it, that they're of not self, is simply that this is not this fixed abiding self. It's not that it doesn't make sense to talk about the self. It does make sense to talk about you, me, and everybody else, which is just as well, because we're all doing it, and you couldn't have a gathering like this without it. We have our name badges. We introduce people to each other, Obviously, we don't think that's all just a complete fiction we're going through. So not self is no self. I'm just repeating myself there. The other thing is, vague borders are still borders. So people talk about the dissolving of the borders between self and other. Okay? So the recognition that there is no sharp dividing line between self and other. I entirely agree. But you must not jump from that to concluding that there is no meaning to the distinction between self and other. There are all sorts of distinctions, real distinctions in the world where the borders are not clear. But it is still nonetheless the case that there is a real difference between things that fall certainly in the middle, even if the point at which they meet is ambiguous. Colour is the most obvious example of this. If you present the colour spectrum one way to another and you focus in on any particular bit of it, you will not be able to see when one colour turns into another. There is no absolute clear distinction between red and orange. But there is a difference between red and orange. That is a real difference. And, if you don't think so, then, try seeing what happens when, Holland plays Spain in the World Cup or something, There is a difference. And the colour might seem a trivial one because it's to do with perception. But actually, I think that most concepts, a lot of concepts, are like this. You cannot find the strict point at which one changes into another, but it's not to say there isn't a difference. Knowledge and opinion, for example, I think that's quite an interesting one. Philosophers have spent a lot of time trying to discover what it is that differentiates knowledge from simple belief or opinion. And I think one reason it's been such an intractable problem is that, in a sense, too many of them have been looking for the acid test, the test which you can apply to any particular claim and say, is that real knowledge or is it just an opinion? Whereas actually, knowledge is, there's a spectrum, and it's to do with degree of justification. And at one end you can talk about knowledge, another end you can talk about opinion. In between, it becomes rather confused. In fact, the best example for this may be subjective and objective, because again, we tend to think of those as being binary opposites. There's a dualism there, but there isn't really. I think I recommend Thomas Nagel on this, his book, The View from Nowhere. On his view, objectivity is something one aims towards. Your perspective becomes more objective the less it depends on the particulars of your particular experience of the world. But it doesn't mean complete objectivity is possible, but that explains why it is more objective to base a finding on randomized controlled experiments than it is on one particular anecdote. The proper experiments are more objective. There's not a complete one. So vague borders are still borders. So yes, there's no self-other distinction in that really strict way, but there is a self-other distinction in which I've sort of tried to use a typographical convention here. There is a difference in which there is perhaps a blending into each other, but still there is an important difference. So this really goes to the question where I'm going back to the title I started with, the duality of non-duality. When we think about the self and we come to embrace a view of the self in which we abandon this idea of the abiding core, the permanent essence, what are we left with? One self, no self, many selves? How does it work? Okay, well, not many, I think. That's one possibility people have come up with. I don't know if Rita's still here. Rita Carter wrote this book on multiplicity, and I've discussed it with her, and it's difference of emphasis, really, we have, but I think it's an important one. Rita made the point that we have, there's a lot of evidence that we don't have, we change according to what we're doing, the situation we're in, and so forth. And so rather than think about there being one self, we have to think of ourselves as all being, to some degree, multiple. Now, I see what she means, but I think that if you think it's a mistake to think of the self as a discrete pearl, if you like, it only magnifies the mistake to think of it as being 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 different pearls. And I think, again, if Rita up here, she would say that that's not what she's trying to suggest, but I think that's the risk you go down if you try and encourage this multiplicity. I don't think the answer to rejecting the idea of a core of self is to say we're a collection of other selves. But similarly, it doesn't make sense, I think, to abandon the idea of a self altogether and claim that there is, no self, we're all just part of one thing. So the way I'd see it is that, what we want is neither multiplicity nor non-existence. So to put it another way, it's not either or both and, but more or less. This is a general point I want to end up in. What do I mean by this? I think a lot of the time, what people do is when they reject a strict dualism, a strict dichotomy, and say, the distinction between self and other, objective, subjective, whatever it might be, this doesn't stand up as a strict distinction. They want to therefore completely collapse it and get rid of it altogether. And I think that's actually playing into the original dualistic mistake, right? Because it's kind of saying that you must either have the dualism or you have to completely give up the dualism. Well, that's a dichotomous choice, isn't it? That's exactly the kind of being excessively keen to see things in binary terms. That's exactly the mistake which lies at the problem of dualism in the first place. So the way I think we should always look at these things is to think more in terms of more or less, or degrees of being, or whatever it might be. There are different forms of language more appropriate to different contexts. But I think it's the shading, it's the gradations. That's where we really need to look in order to really understand, I think, all sorts of things about reality, actually. and that to just claim that all distinctions are just the creation of concepts and experience and everything is really one is, in a sense, as simplistic as saying that everything lines up neatly as being on an either-or side of a dichotomy. You want this more or less way of looking at things. So it's from dualism to what you might call something like gradualism. It's not a proper term. I don't recommend it to you, but for our purposes today, it's quite neat, of course, because it's just dualism with a gra at the beginning. So again, it rhymes. It's very helpful if things you want to learn or get over rhyme. It just helps. So it's from dualism to gradualism. Self and other is not this neat flipping of a switch, but there is a gradation between self and other, and there are points in between where it becomes less clear. To put it another way, I'd put it as not one, but some. And what I mean by that is, again, you can think about this in the way we think about language. In language, you have count nouns. In English, you have non-count nouns. So a cow is a count noun, and it's called a count noun because you can count them. 1 cow, 2 cows, 3 cows, 4 cows. Milk is not a count noun. You have some milk. I mean, if you talk about units, 100 milliliters, you turn it into a count noun. But normally speaking, you talk about some of something or more of it. With count nouns, it's another. And I think, these are two sort of different ways of looking at the world. And a lot of things in the world, it makes sense for practical purposes, if not for deep philosophical purposes, to treat them as though they were objects, and it becomes one more and so forth. But with a lot of other things, it makes more sense to think of things as being more fluid. Hence, fluids are typical count nouns: water, milk, beer. And that's another way of trying to look at what we are. It still makes sense to talk about more and less and so forth. It just doesn't make sense to talk about exists, doesn't exist, is or isn't. The final, though, conclusion I'd say here is you abandon logic at your peril. I think sometimes, and let me put up the next bit underneath here, is that I think people sometimes, I get this a lot from conversations with people over the years when you talk about the self, is that people come to a recognition that something like the self, it may not be the self that they're talking about or the I, but they come to the recognition that either or doesn't really work very well for describing a particular aspect of reality. But then they sort of run away with that a bit and then think either or is not a good way of thinking at all about anything. And basically the problem is logic. The problem is reason and rationality. Now, I think the problem might sometimes be that an excessive desire to bring logical purity to our understanding, we impose absolute dichotomous categories on things when they don't belong there. But I think it would be a real mistake to think that the problem is fundamentally the logic of contradiction is false, right? The logic of contradiction is simply that, in crude terms, that a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time. And I think you get rid of that at your peril. Now, there are lots of things where people would say, hey, it's far too limiting. But if people come up with examples of why this might be too limiting, you find they're not actually examples of it at all. So you might say something like, you can't say, am I a very outgoing person? Well, I am. In some ways I am, in some ways I'm not. So I am both outgoing and not outgoing. What does your logic say about that then? Because your logic demands it's either true that I'm outgoing or false that I'm outgoing. Well, no, only a very stupid, crude application of logic would say that. Because what you mean when you say that is actually sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. That's not a logical contradiction, okay? That's not literally saying something which is both true and false at the same time. That's what the law of non-contradiction says, that something cannot be both true and not true at the same time. And that is a fundamental restriction on clear thinking, That's how you assert how many people in a room at a time. This isn't a matter of opinion whether or not. There's a certain number of people in this room, and it is either true or false that number of people are in this room, right? Well, it will be true. If you add one to it, it becomes false. You can't make sense of the world unless you embrace that. So I think that, again, in being very clear that from, if you like, an ontological, metaphysical way of looking at the world, often, things are not dualistic. There is a type of dualism which is a logical thing, a principle of non-contradiction, which is very, very important. And in fact, I'd say you cannot think clearly about what a non-duality means unless you use that logic. And in fact, whether people endorse it explicitly or not, every time someone gives a talk at something like this, and they're giving their reasons and their argument, they are doing precisely that. They are using their reason to persuade you. They're not trying to use anything other than their reason to persuade you. So that'd be the last point. And like all the points I've said, really, don't take this as being any opinion or prejudgment about what people here think. I make this point because I come across a lot of people who, if you like, beliefs about the metaphysics and ontology of selves, what fundamentally makes us who we are, to conclusions about, if you like, ethics, phenomenology, existence. Because I think often it's kind of assumed that, for example, if you reach the conclusion that there is no abiding core of self, that therefore it follows that one should live in a way which makes one as aware of that as possible, for example. So it's a good idea perhaps to practice your whatever form of meditation you use in order to minimize this sense. But, I think the question really is, well, why? Why is that? It doesn't follow at all. I think, the thing about the world is that there are levels of description and levels of experience. Different things are true depending on how you look at them. So chairs always seem to be good examples whenever we talk about real existence of objects. But, there's a chair, and at the level of existence of medium-sized objects like ourselves, that's a chair. You zoom in with a microscope, it just becomes a collection of particles. Does that mean the chair is an illusion? No. It means that at that level of description, chair is no longer a useful category, no longer a visible one. You go to a much bigger area, and again, it vanishes in a different way. It seems to me that there are all sorts of levels of description, levels at which we can understand reality, and you cannot sort of say that the true one, you shouldn't privilege one over the other. The true one is not necessarily, if you like, the smallest one. And from an existential point of view, I would say it'd be disastrous to think that, right? I mean, who would treat another human being on the basis of how they appear from an understanding of fundamental physics? I mean, that's just the wrong way to think ethically. To think ethically, you need to think at the level of description at which we understand the world. So I think there's a real question mark you need to ask, which is, even if you buy into certain views about the nature of self and what fundamentally underlies it, what follows from that about how we should live our lives? Should we be struggling to give things up? Now, there are lots of answers to that. There are certain benefits, I think, to be involved with a lessening of attachment to self, with exercises which remind us of the extent to which we are not as unified as we think we are in normal experience, and so forth. So there are lots of things around that. But I wonder whether it's really, whether it becomes the most important thing at all to live in full awareness of that as much as possible. And I think perhaps, in a way, the best answer to that is when people do feel that that's the way to live, it's actually because they find it a helpful, fulfilling way to live. And if they do, that's absolutely fine. But then I suppose I'm very questionable of the claim that they then might make, which is that not only is living that way something which they find deeply fulfilling, but that's a more truthful way of living, and if you chose to live that way too, you too would find it more fulfilling, and you too would be living more in accordance with your true nature. That I find questionable. I think that there's a level of reality in which I exist and chairs exist, and I'm very different from the chair and you. And I think that's quite real. So I want to end just by saying thank you, right? Okay? I'm not thanking an amorphous mass or an undifferentiated plenum. I'm thanking you.